Hey everybody, I'm Austin Cole.
And I'm Mike Flannery.
Welcome to another episode of Real Talks, where Mike and I discuss real estate, asset accumulation, and lending. Today we're going to be talking about duplexes and multifamily properties and how individuals leverage these properties to their advantage, especially first-time home buyers. And then we're going to do a really cool local product review. This week we've got Stonks. It's a Pilsner Lager from Venture Brewing on North Avenue in Wauwatosa. I thought it was really fitting because Stonks, you know, it's sort of Reddit slang for stocks, which, of course, are also good long-term investments, just like duplexes and multifamilies, Mike.
True statement.
So here's what we're talking about today, guys. You know, we deal with a lot of first-time home buyers, a lot of younger buyers, and I think there's sort of maybe a little bit of a misconception sometimes that, you know, if you want to ultimately own duplexes and multifamily properties and have a portfolio of investment properties that generate income, there's sort of a misconception, I think, that those are properties that you get down the line, right? You know, you buy your house first, and then, hey, when you got enough money, you upgrade, and, you know, you buy a duplex. Now you live in your house, and you got your duplex that you rent out. But it's not always the case. We actually have a lot of people that sort of take advantage of it in the opposite order. They buy an investment property, I guess you could call it that, a duplex or a multifamily first, and live in it.
Right, and there's a ton of benefits to buying a property, whether it's a duplex or possibly a 3 or a 4 unit. We see a lot of clients looking into that option too, and you have a huge amount of power when it comes to buying a property like that, being that you're going to live in it or you're going to occupy the property as an owner, because it allows you to put a lot less down. And then down the road, if you end up, getting into something else and wanting to rent out both units or all 3 or all 4, whatever the situation is, you obviously have already gotten in for a smaller investment because you bought it, as an owner-occupied property, which a lot of our clients are doing because it opens up, a lot of different doors down the road, but also it gives them the flexibility to not only have, like in the duplex scenario that we just talked about, have the one side of it or the upper or whatever the situation is be their primary residence, and then the other unit they're obviously renting out and collecting rents on, and so the mortgage payment then becomes a lot less for that individual because they've got that other side to collect from. So it's a really cool thing to look at, and there are a lot of people that are doing this, like you said, in the reverse order, of sorts, which is buying a multi-unit property, living in it for a year or two, whatever the case is, and then eventually moving on to something else, and then that property is just an investment property to collect some cash flow on.
Right. I think for a lot of people, it's the correct order. A lot of people that I've dealt with, Mike, that ultimately buy a duplex or a multifamily property as their first property, they're individuals that maybe were in a situation where it almost seemed like buying a single-family home was too intimidating to take on an entire house and an entire mortgage payment all on their own. And I think a lot of people maybe start off with the idea of, well, if I were to buy a house, I'd need to find somebody to live with me, to maybe rent a room too, because maybe I'm a little nervous about taking on the whole mortgage, and I want somebody to sort of help subsidize the mortgage, right? And I think sometimes people sort of elevate that thought process and say, well, geez, I still want my privacy. I still sort of want my own space. And, obviously it gets complicated sometimes, if you're renting out to friends and things like that in your house, right? And I think sort of the next step up then is to have a multifamily where you actually are renting to somebody, whether it is a friend, family member, or a stranger, of course, but they have their very own space. That's the special thing about these duplexes and multifamily properties. It's kind of the same concept, right? I mean, You get to own a property and somebody's essentially helping you pay the mortgage off, right? Except I think, when we talk about these multifamily properties, it's almost more extreme because you can charge so much more in rent. We know a lot of people that maybe bought a house, sure, their mortgage payments maybe $1,000, $1,200 a month, something like that, and they have a friend live with them and rent a room for $300 or $400. But you buy a duplex, and your mortgage payment on a duplex, for example, let's say it's a $200,000 duplex, you might have a mortgage payment of, after tax and everything, maybe $1,750, something like that. You might be able to rent out the other half of that duplex for $1,500 in a lot of cases, and you're basically living for $250 a month.
Right, and every scenario is different, right? It's all just going to depend on the property and what it is. But ultimately, for those of you that don't know or haven't looked into this option, on the financing end of it, if you're buying a single family home and you plan to live in it, there is many options of what type of loan you can do, right? And the minimum down payments and that kind of thing. When you look at multi-unit properties as an owner-occupied loan, there are some differences to the guidelines and differences to the down payments because there is more than one unit. And so the benefit of possibly looking at doing this for not only your first purchase, right, but just as an owner-occupied situation in general is because you are able to put a lot less money down. And so, the client that we were talking about that has now acquired 3 duplexes, has lived in each one. So he bought the first one, lived in it for a year or two with his brother, bought another one, moved into that next property, and then he just repeats the process and keeps moving because his goal long term and big picture is to acquire 3 to 5 properties for as little capital or as little cash down as possible. And so what that individual is doing is doing an FHA loan with 3.5% to 5% down, and just keeps repeating the process. And so it's really quite an awesome strategy, honestly, because what this individual is doing is actually renovating the property while he lives in it. So he kind of lives, in the downstairs or upstairs, whatever, renovates the one that's vacant. And then once that one is completed, he obviously collects more rent because it's updated. And then he just keeps repeating the process. So it's really cool to see some individuals not just lean towards single family homes and look at it that way. And then, kind of shift the mentality into, hey, this probably isn't my forever home anyway. So maybe looking at, a multi-unit property, isn't such a bad idea long term, and for the immediate future.
I think it just gives you so much flexibility when you go the route of buying a duplex or a multifamily property as your first property, especially for individuals that were maybe in a situation like what I was in several years ago. If you're single, for example, I think a lot of people, when you think about buying a house and things like that, I think sometimes people almost have like sort of that hump that they want to get over in terms of, hey, I at least want to be able to share the mortgage with somebody, maybe a partner, or if I have a family, things like that. I think sometimes it can be intimidating when you're all by yourself. And I was in that situation several years ago. I wanted to buy a property, but I was alone, right? I was by myself, and I had the thought. I said, maybe it would make more sense if I bought a 2-family property, and that way, I sort of have somebody helping me out with the mortgage. And down the line, obviously, I have the plan of buying a single-family property, and that you can keep the duplex as an investment. And,
right.
And what I can say is that it actually really plays out nicely in terms of if you look at the way your portfolio may develop over the long term. If you have a 2-family or a multifamily property as your first property, when you go to upgrade or move out rather and buy a single family property, you can actually, once you rent out both units now, you're probably going to be generating more in rent, and you should be, really. You better be doing this. You should be generating more in rent than what you're putting out to the property in terms of the mortgage payment and taxes. You should actually be netting income from that property, and you can actually use that to then subsidize your mortgage payment on your single-family property. So it starts this snowball process, right? You lived in the duplex. You had a low payment for yourself because you had a tenant upstairs or downstairs, essentially paying most of the mortgage. And then when you move out and you put a tenant in the other unit that you had, now you've got, in many cases, we see individuals that buy duplexes that they're generating, 500 to maybe 750, maybe even $1,000 a month additional on top of what they're shelling out for that mortgage payment, right? And again, like you said, it depends on the situation.
Right.
There's all sorts, you can buy multifamily properties for $150,000. You can buy multifamily properties up to $1 million or more. If you get these really nice ones. So, it's a very subjective thing, but it starts that snowball process. And I think it's a really, really great thing, and it's a really smart route to go.
Right, and the for sure thing is because when you own properties and you're collecting rents, you have to understand too that the upkeep of the property is a cost to you as well, right? So if there are things like water heaters or a furnace or windows or whatever, just regular maintenance that you have in your home, that obviously falls on you as the homeowner and not the tenants, right? So you kind of have this. Cash flow that comes in, and then understand the mortgage payment needs to get made, but there's also other things that obviously might, need to be put into the property. So on your tax returns and the way that people claim rental income and some of that stuff, it can get pretty complicated. And some people end up actually, taking a loss on certain properties, depending on if you renovate it or put money in or whatever. But yes, in most cases, people are either equalizing the mortgage payment. So, when we pull a credit report, if it shows that you own a property and the mortgage payment is $1,500, and we show that you're collecting rent on 2 units at $1,000 a piece, obviously there's a little bit of positive income there that we might be able to use, like Austin was saying, to qualify you for a future purchase. So in some ways it can not just offset, right, but it can go, positive and actually have income for you on a monthly basis. So that part of it is great. The for sure bet when you're buying a either 2, 3, 4 unit is not only are you making the mortgage payment every month and collecting rents, whether it's from one individual because you're living in the other half or both, like the client we were talking about before, and you've moved on. The for sure thing is the balance of what you owe on that property is going down, right? Because you're making the mortgage payment, and so you're building equity. And so if somebody, whether it's a tenant or 2 tenants or 3, depending on what the scenario is, those individuals are paying you, rent to essentially pay off the debt that you owe. And so you're building equity in the process, regardless whether you're actually, bringing home cash after the mortgage payment or not. So that's really the ultimate value out of buying a multi-unit, in my opinion, is that you're paying down the debt, and the property values, as we're seeing, are obviously increasing, year over year. And so you've got, whether it's, a couple $100,000 on a larger unit, or just the monthly rents that you're collecting. But the equity position is really, I think, the best benefit to look at this now.
One thing that you said earlier when we were discussing the topic we wanted to talk about today was that as a landlord, remember, you have full control over what the rent is on your property that you own, right? And so when you take out a mortgage, and if you have a monthly payment on a property like that, that's always going to be the same, right? I mean, it's not like your mortgage payment goes up with time, right? You lock in that interest rate, you lock in that payment, and unless you refinance, it's always going to be the same, but rents typically go up, right, with inflation and as costs increase. So you might find yourself in a situation where you've owned a property, a duplex or a multifamily, that it not only have your tenants been paying down your mortgage for you, and not only has the property itself appreciated in value, but you also are probably going to be charging more in rent down the line, and your payment has stayed the same. So it really is just this huge snowball effect that happens there. I think it's a wonderful thing. One more thing I'll sort of interject, and then we'll move on to our little Saturday sampler here, guys, and this points into what you were saying, which is there's a lot of unknowns that come with owning these kind of properties, right? You have to really be able to almost have like a balance, like a spreadsheet, so that way you have funds available when there's issues, if you do have a water heater blowout or a furnace, or, a tenant damages the property, things like that.
Yep.
What I see a lot of people do when they buy investment properties like this, they actually run them as a business, right? I see a lot of people title properties like this in an LLC, and they run it like a business. I mean, literally, the rent coming in goes into its own bank account, its own separate account.
Yep.
The owners will pay themselves out of that account a certain amount, but of course, a certain amount of the income coming in from the rent is being put into a reserve fund, essentially, for things like upgrades, repairs, and just general maintenance. So it's a real smart way to do it too.
It is, and that's ultimately how we see most of it done, is that people operate it as a business, because it is income that you're generating through owning real estate, which is the beauty of this whole thing. So something to think about. We have a lot of first-time home buyers that are interested in buying duplexes all the way up to 4-family properties. Some people live in them, some people don't, but ultimately it's a really good, at least, idea to think about. If you're shopping for a house, doesn't always have to be single family. You can leverage different styles of property to accumulate wealth and help you a little bit along the way.
I think it's a really smart thing to consider. I think especially for individuals, if you're not quite sure what you want to do, and if it is your first property, and maybe if you are somebody that is single, or maybe newly married, and you really want to get a leg up, right? Really put yourself in an advantageous situation, and you don't need a single family property yet. It's a really, really great way to sort of get a head start on a portfolio. You can always add to that down the line. It's really awesome. And it can be anybody, really, guys. I don't want to
absolutely
say that you have to be single or newly married or anything like that. We have families that buy these properties all the time, but I think really a lot of people, young adults, if you're by yourself, I mean, geez, it's just, to me, in many cases, it's a no-brainer, right?
It is, and I think the one last thing that I'll just give an example of is there's a client that I'm working with that lives in New York, and I got a call. He's referred to me and said, "Hey, my thought process is, I'm from Wisconsin. All my in-laws, still live there. I live in New York, and I'm looking at properties for sale in New York, and it's absolutely outrageous. For those of you that don't know, obviously the property values out there, you get very, very little for an insane amount of money, just the way that it is. And so he's not interested in buying property there, but he was interested in obtaining specifically a duplex." here in Milwaukee because he wants his in-laws to live in one side and he can use the other as an Airbnb or a short-term rental, as well as a secondary property for himself when he comes to visit. So it's kind of a cool conversation that I had with him about buying property here and why he thought that was just a much smarter idea from a financial perspective versus shelling out, $600,000 or $700,000 for a very small place in New York City versus some sort of multi-unit. Down there it's in the millions of dollars, guys. You can go look. It's pretty wild. So it's pretty cool just to kind of get that perspective and how people use multi-unit properties for different reasons. Some people use the Airbnb route, right? That's something that we see coming onto the scene for the past couple of years, but now it seems to be just a part of the world, right? Some people choose that over hotels anymore, right? So having options like that within a multi-unit is pretty cool, I think.
It is actually a really good way, and then we'll move on to the little Saturday sampler, guys. It's a really good way for families to also sort of stay involved with each other, if they want to live together, but, at least have their own separate living spaces. We literally had a client that we were working with recently that, father-daughter situation. She wanted her own space, of course, and then so did he. They wanted to live together, wanted to live by each other, but it's just nice for them to have their own separate spaces, for obvious reasons, right? So,
yep.
Really cool thing. So, okay, guys.
About.
Yeah, really, really awesome. So, all right, moving on to stonks. So, this is playing off the recent GameStop stock trend. I'm sure a lot of people have followed that GME surge, with the Reddit Wall Street Bets forum. Yeah, so we got diamond hands and then rocket emoji on the label. So, diamond hands just means that you just hold a stock forever. You don't sell it.
For anybody that's watching that doesn't know what we're talking about, you should definitely go look at that. I think that's pretty wild. Just with the technology that we have at our fingertips and the world that we live in. If you don't know that story of what occurred, I would look into that. It's pretty wild.
I would say tread lightly with this stuff. So there's a lot of new investors. I'm not saying that I'm like an experienced trader with stocks. Obviously, I'm only 28. I can't be that experienced. But this whole GameStop thing that happened, I think, really spiked a lot of interest in the stock market and trading stocks. You can download apps on your phone now like E-Trade and Webull and things like that and trade stocks for free.
Blah, blah, blah.
Robinhood's the big one, too.
A lot of people are doing it.
These big pump stocks, I just want to say this, though, as somebody that does have a small amount of experience with it. When you have these companies that honestly, truly aren't really worth that much, like GameStop, I mean, this is sort of a failing company, and you have these like big pumps that are just happening. It really is stock market manipulation. That's really what it is. And honestly, if you want to sort of have a more guaranteed way to make money, you really just want to invest your money into companies that you think are actually going to go up in value rather than trying to like play these weird manipulation swings.
Yeah, the day trading stuff. Or just buy real estate. That seems to work pretty well for most people.
But if you are going to buy stocks, buy something good that's going to be guaranteed to go up.
So I will just say the first thing I noticed about this, the color of this weirds me out a little bit. It almost looks like a light beer with like kind of a champagne-y color to me.
I think probably the lighting that we have is maybe doing a little bit to it, but I mean, it is a Pilsner. So, guys, for those of you that don't know all the terms of beer, a Pilsner is a very light style, a lager beer. Just by comparison, a Miller Lite is a Pilsner lager, okay? So this is sort of a craft beer take on, I guess you could say a craft beer take on like a Miller Lite or something like that, right? But it's way better, obviously.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. I like the design. I mean, the idea of it's pretty funny to me, so that caught my attention.
It's a crusher. So I will say I really like Venture Brewing. So they're located right off of 55th and North
Ave.
Yep. I think maybe a couple blocks west of that, but
super cool place. Never been.
It's a coffee shop. They brew their coffee there, and they also have some baked goods. I don't know if they make the bakery stuff themselves or if they're getting that locally, but they got like some pastries and stuff. But it's a coffee shop by day and drinking establishment by night. Now you can get a beer any time of the day. I've definitely slammed a beer at 10 in the morning at Venture, and I've also slammed a coffee at 10 o'clock at night. So,
right, it goes both ways.
It's pretty cool. But so I always like to rate the beers. Now I will say, with a Pilsner and a lager like this, it can only get so good.
55th and North.
That's exactly what I thought it was. Yep. It can only get so good because it is like a lighter style, but you almost have to look at it subjectively, like within that style. I mean, if you were going to drink a Pilsner lager, This is like a really, really fantastic beer. I mean, I would just overall give it a rating. You know, it's very, very crushable. I don't know. I would give it a rating of probably, I don't know. I'm going to give it a 66. I think it's a very good beer. I can't rate it super high just because I think it's just hard to make a mind-blowing Pilsner. But for a Pilsner, if you were just going to say, as a Pilsner, I definitely would give it a much higher score. But in the grand scheme of things, against some of the other beers we reviewed, I like it.
I'm not a huge fan of, I guess, just trying to mix all the different types into the craft brewery game. There's so many different, styles and all that stuff. That's a little more basic, but it's still pretty good. I just want to say though, on Venture's website, you can buy coffee right online, have it shipped to your door, $5 for shipping, and they have some pretty crazy stuff. And I've met clients and just people within the business at Venture many times. It's a pretty cool place, and their coffee's outstanding. So pretty cool little spot.
They actually had a really cool beer. I don't know if they still have it. It was like a raw. What did they call it? It was like a raw IPA or something. Essentially, they didn't boil it. They never boiled the beer. They just literally, when you make beer, you soak the grains in water, and then when you drain that out, you have sugar water essentially, and that's what you pitch your yeast into, and then that becomes the beer. But normally you boil it before you put the yeast in there. They just didn't boil it. They just literally soaked the grains and took the sugar water out, threw some hops in it, threw some yeast in there, and called it a day. And it was like a raw beer. It was amazing.
They've got some really good coffee stouts too. I was trying to think that the name of the one that I was thinking of is not on here, but yeah, they've got some pretty unique stuff over there. I'm a fan.
Well, that's about it, guys. Really, really good beer. I hate to not give it a higher score, but I agree with you. It's hard to mix all these together. But really, really good beer. I do recommend it, and definitely check out Venture Brewing. But so that's another episode of Real Talks, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that, and we'll be coming at you again next week.
Have a good rest of your weekend.
Take care, everybody. Keep it real.